And if you trace the history of that word all the way back to the beginning, there's all the way down the tree at the very beginning, poliomyelitis was a symptom. It was purely describing inflammation of the gray matter of the spinal cord. And you literally would see people use it as, like I mentioned in the book, you have a headache, or they might say you have a poliomyelitis, which is you have a lesion in your spinal cord, and that's why you are experiencing paralysis. So it's important to understand, as we speak about polio, keep in mind the clock on the side of the screen, the year, because as you go back in time, it didn't mean what you and I think of it as. So the reality of polio is it's really a description of paralysis, neuronal, or paralysis of the neurons that cause weakness in your muscles. And we don't know why. You and I think of it as, oh, the poliovirus caused it. The reality, as we'll see if we continue this discussion far enough, is there were many, many different things that could cause this, most of which can be attributed to a man-made change that happened. It's easy to document.
So this is a classic example, and in fact, all of your work that I've encountered so far falls under the heading of what we say, welcome to complex systems. Mm-hmm. And we have discussed extensively on Dark Horse the fact that those who would apply the rules of complicated systems to complex systems create hazard after hazard. That complex systems have a distinct toolkit for engaging them. And what you're saying is a perfect example. We have something phenomenological. You've got inflammation of the gray matter of the spine that is associated with paralysis. That's an observation. It would be strange if only one thing caused that. Inflammation is a very general condition, and the fact that the inflammation can lead to paralysis suggests there ought to be at least a short list of things that could cause this. And the idea that poliomyelitis is the observation of that inflammation, which I understand from you can only be positively ID'd after death, that you need to actually look at the spine, a cross-section, is that right?
Well, it's the only way you could trace the actual origin of what the inflammation is coming from.
Right. But the idea that, okay, you would expect a number of things to be able to cause what was once upon a time called poliomyelitis, but that a historical process has caused scientists and doctors to hone in on a cause, which already is suspect, and then to shorten the name as if the polio virus is synonymous with the inflammation that causes the paralysis. And one of the great strengths of your book is that it's not that the polio virus doesn't exist or isn't involved. It's involved in a much more complex story, and that story explains what medical professionals, it explains their error as well as the phenomenology of the disease itself.
Yeah, that was, this thing called Koch's postulates, which is essentially I would say at the time, a fairly a good step in the right direction is to assume that infection, had one source, that there was one source of disease. If we could find it and inject it into another healthy specimen and confirm that it affected that specimen in the same way, then we had isolated the cause of the disease. Now, sure, it makes sense. Probably has, advanced the cause of science quite a bit. Unfortunately,
yes and no. It's advanced it in a way, but it's a classic example of a rule from complicated systems applied to a complex system. The idea that if this virus and this disease are really related, that nobody who's got the virus should fail to have the disease, and nobody who's got the disease should fail to have the virus. No, that's just simply not going to be true. So has it done some good? Probably. Has it done more good than harm? That is a much more difficult question.
Yeah. Well, keep in mind the state of things in which it was born from. At the time, you might consider it an advance, given the insane medical theories that were circulating at the time. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's not great, but it was an improvement on some things at the time, and did advance the cause of microbiology, of science in general, of medicine in some way. But unfortunately, when I say polio, without me having to air quote it every time, I speak of polio generically in the context of paralysis from something. And unfortunately, they focused on a single virus as the cause, even when they knew there were multiple viruses, bacteria, and other environmental factors that could cause nearly the same thing. So, as I was mentioning, going back to the original, that's funny, discovery was 1894, Rutland, Vermont. Go to any website and they'll tell you that was the original polio outbreak in the United States. Horses died, dogs died, chickens died. Okay, strange. Why did that happen? Well, some more sleuth.
Beyond, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but beyond strange, because this is exactly why it's so important to think in terms of complex systems. A virus is going to have difficulty infecting. The ability to infect one creature effectively comes at the cost of infecting other creatures. So they tend to be specific. The idea that this virus emerges out of nowhere and is capable of infecting and apparently spreading between animals from many different clades is suspect on its face. It suggests a different kind of cause. And so if you're looking at this from a complicated systems perspective, you say, well, okay, viruses spread between creatures. These are creatures. They're all, vertebrates. Right? And so anyway, you can talk yourself into believing that, yes, the virus is just very capable of spreading between these many creatures. But the places where viruses spread between many creatures, there's a story to be discovered evolutionarily. For example, viruses that spread between humans and domesticated animals. Obviously, there's an advantage to being able to hop that particular gap. So something that is capable of speaking swine and human has an advantage. Birds have a disproportionate capacity to distribute something across barriers because they fly. So anyway, there's always an evolutionary story. In this case, a disease comes out of nowhere shortly after the Civil War and is spreading sort of incoherently between many different species. That's funny.